Hi, everybody. Scott Dreyer here with DryerCoaching.com and part 8. This should be the last installment. If you watch all this so far, I wish I could give you a medal. You've done very well. I'm very impressed that you've hung with me so far. Thank you so much. This is a book study of a book that I've enjoyed so much. I want to share with you guys as well. And it's called Checkmate in Berlin by Giles Morton, a British author. And we're reaching now the epilogue of the book near the very, very end. And we've looked in part 7 about the Berlin airlift. From 45 to 48, it's very clear the Russians and the West just not on the same page. Now, obviously, French, Americans, British, there are very real differences. The book shows those differences, but overall, our three countries believe in things like self-government, self-rule, freedom, free elections. The Soviets very much the opposite. And so by 48, it was very clear these two sides couldn't be reconciled. Stalin then put a blockade around Berlin in June of 48. It lasted until May of 49, about 11 months. So meanwhile, this part now is a book on page 310, epilogue. And so after 11 months of blockade, it was very clear that the Allies were winning. We were bringing stuff in. And it was going to be near the end of the blockade soon. As the siege of Berlin was drawing to its close, a drama of global significance was unfolding in Washington, D.C. In the austere splendor of the State Department, President Truman's new Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, was presiding over an unprecedented gathering of the world's most influential figures. The date was Monday, April 4th, 1949. So again, this is about a month and a half before the Berlin airlift ended. We weren't sure it was going to end yet, but it seemed like it would be soon. And Washington was playing host to 1,300 distinguished invitees and a radio audience of millions. The U.S. State Department predicted that the day's events would attract the biggest global audience in radio history. So they 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they met in the State Department in the vast auditorium. And there were people there to sign to establish what was called NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, NATO. And that included the countries in alphabetical order, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, tiny Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the UK, and the US. So the idea of this NATO was an attack on one is an attack on all. So by April 49, it was very clear that the Russians were not our allies. They were very clearly our adversaries. We had seen earlier about that spy who defected in Canada and brought all his documentation. And so it's very clear that the Allied relationship for World War II was long gone. And so these Western countries formed NATO. Now, Russia was very angry about NATO. Moscow's response had come some days earlier, an outpouring of withering outrage, with the Kremlin slamming the treaty as an illegal act of aggression. Quote, it runs counter to the Yalta and Potsdam agreements, in which Britain and the United States assumed their obligation to cooperate in the consolidation of peace. Didn't that sound nice? The British government sent a stinging rebuke, castigating the Soviet authorities for violating every clause of the Potsdam Agreement, acts that had culminated in the 11-month blockade of Berlin. So what hypocrisy. The Russians are criticizing us for creating NATO, but meanwhile, they had broken lots of the agreements of Yalta and Potsdam. Yalta's over here. So they met together for this gathering. Here's again, this is where the author is so funny. At 3 o'clock, as 3 o'clock approached, the U.S. Marine Band began playing jaunty Gershwin melodies that included Bess, You Is My Woman Now. It was intended as a compliment to the First Lady, Mrs. Truman, Bess Truman, seated in the front row. But a few senior diplomats could be seen shaking their heads in disapproval. It seemed too frivolous a song for such an august occasion. August means formal. And so, how American. Here's this very world-changing event. We're establishing NATO, and the band is playing these Gershwin show tunes about Bess, you is my woman now, even with bad grammar. So, just seems very American to me somehow. Great author, Great author. So a lot of these NATO people, they all gave a speech before they signed their name, committed the country to NATO. But a lot of it was very, there was an air of a lot of optimism, Dr. Dirk Steiker of the Netherlands injected a soberer note into the day's proceedings. Quote, "The treaty we're about to sign marks the end of an illusion, ILLUSION, he said, the hope that the United Nations would by itself ensure international peace. This had been President Roosevelt's cherished dream, the big idea he had brought to the Yalta Conference 4 years earlier. But the United Nations had proved unable to guarantee the peace in such turbulent times. A charming dream, said one, from which we had awakened gradually to a gray reality. A new, more robust organization was needed, one so powerful that it would deter the Soviet Union from ever risking war with the West." So kind of like the League of Nations after World War I, very optimistic, very idealistic, maybe very naive. And so this the Dutch prime minister said, "Hey, we need to get real. United Nations is not going to guarantee world peace. We need actually a military something here, more teeth in it." The founding of NATO marked the end of America's cherished policy of isolation. In a speech 6 years earlier, Truman had blamed the outbreak of the Second World War on America's isolationist attitude in the aftermath of the Great War, World War I. Now his vision was for America to embrace the world, and he would use his second term as president to bring it to fruition. As one commentator put it, the United States abandoned economic isolation with a Marshall Plan, abandoned political isolation by joining the United Nations, and abandoned military isolation by joining NATO. Moreover, the foundation of NATO was not the only momentous event to take place that spring. So spring of 49, very important time. On the very date the western sectors of Berlin were celebrating their liberation from the Soviet blockade, that's over here. So on this date when they were celebrating this liberation, American, British, and French military governors signed off on a constitution for the Western occupied zones of Germany. This marked the birth of the Federal Republic, West Germany, and was a turning point in the history of the post-war world. In the Democratic elections held later that summer, Konrad Adenauer won the chancellorship of West Germany on a clear platform: the creation of a stable democratic state irrevocably allied with the West. Adenauer's overriding ambition, born of a deep mistrust of Stalin, was to, quote, "integrate Germany completely into Western Europe." He got his way in the spring of 1955, when West Germany became a signatory of NATO. 10 years after Nazi Germany's humiliating defeat, the old enemy had become a trusted friend. So we have here the day of this blockade being lifted. The powers of the U.S., Britain, France signed up together saying, "Hey, the three of us, we can't cooperate with the Russians. We don't trust them. We can't work with those people. We're going to create our new country. There's no way we can have one German government. With this face reality, and we're going to call this the Federal Republic of Germany." That's became West Germany. And the capital is over here in a place called Bonn. It's a smallish city on the Rhine River. And Konrad Adenauer was a devout Catholic, and he's also from Western Germany. He didn't like the East Germans so much. He thought Berlin had a history of a lot of militarism and blood and stuff, and so he did not want, this to be the German capital. Moreover, Berlin is, in the Russian zone. And when I was in Germany, I was also told the West German thought was putting the capital in Berlin and Bonn sent two messages. One, it said, "Hey, Bonn was the birthplace of Beethoven." So it says Germany is not only about Adolf Hitler. And as I mentioned earlier, Hitler was not even German. He was from Austria. Okay, he was from down here in Austria. So it sent a message that Germany is also the country of Beethoven and art and culture and sophistication. Okay. Moreover, Bonn being kind of a middle-sized city sent a message that we believe the division of Germany will be temporary. We do not accept this to be permanent. And so West Germany's capital was was Bonn. Okay. So you had NATO being formed in 1949. Now, the eastern part of Germany, let's discuss East Germany. Okay, so this is what was called the Russian zone. It became known as East Germany. Okay, the eastern sector of the city, or East Berlin, had a very different narrative from the western part of the city. So even though West Germany was here, this part here became also free. I was there in 1985. It was wealthy. It was independent. Well, not independent. It was like non-communist, free, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of travel, etc. So it's like a little island of freedom deep in Russian territory. So the eastern sector of the city had a very different narrative from the western side. In response to the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, the Soviet military administration announced the creation of the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, on October 8th, 1949. So this became West Germany, Federal Republic. This became East Germany, German Democratic Republic, different country. It was to have its East Berlin as its capital, in direct contravention of the Potsdam Agreement. So Potsdam said no capital in Berlin, but they broke that agreement as well. The top jobs went to a familiar trio of revolutionaries. The elderly William Pieck was appointed president of the new state, with Otto Grotewohl as chancellor. Walter Ulbricht was initially appointed deputy prime minister, but he was soon named as first secretary of the Socialist Unity Party, which we saw a few lessons back, becoming the de facto leader of the country. So basically, the president and chancellor were figureheads. The party leader, he was the big cheese. And in 1953, the people in East Germany, they realized they're falling behind. They could realize the West was getting wealthy, was getting free. They're falling behind. And tragically, in the summer of 53, there was a workers' uprising, and it was crushed. So how ironic, communists claim to be, we're all about workers and workers' rights and workers of the world unite. Well, the workers did unite in a strike, and it was crushed by Russian troops and East German troops. After the brutal crushing of the East German uprising in 1953, the Kremlin threw its weight behind Ulbricht and allowed him to increase his grip on power. 8 years after leaving the Hotel Lux in Moscow, he had secured the autocratic authority he had so long craved. Under his lackluster leadership, East Berlin would undergo economic stagnation and decline, along with the hemorrhaging of its dynamic young population. Hold that thought. So a lot of the younger people who were young and smart and mobile, they realized, hey, this place is really happening. It's growing. It's free. This place is getting more and more restrictive. So a lot of younger people were leaving the country. Those living in the east of the city could cross into the western sectors and see the conspicuous wealth of display in lavishly stocked shop windows. Many chose to leave, a trickle that soon turned into a flood. Ulbricht's dramatic response came in 1961, when he ordered the construction of the Berlin Wall. In so doing, the city was physically split into two separate halves, and it became virtually impossible for any inhabitant in the eastern sector to cross over to the west. So let's unpack this here for a moment. So pretty early on, by like 49, 50, early on, the Russians built a wall from here, from the Baltic Sea all the way down between East and West Germany, and over here on Czechoslovakia, and more or less from the Baltic Sea down here to Yugoslavia. They built a wall. It's called the Iron Curtain. Once, when I was teaching high school, I had some students say, Mr. Dreyer, our teacher in middle school said the Iron Curtain was an imaginary line, like the equator. Not true. It was a physical wall. I've been there before. I'd crossed over from Austria to Czechoslovakia. It had concrete barricades, barbed wire, guard towers, German Shepherd dogs, soldiers with guns. Normally soldiers in groups of 3. Why? If they're alone, they get bolt for freedom. If there are 2 of them, they might, connive and conspire to bolt for freedom. So they almost always had guards in groups of 3. So even if 2 were discussing running to freedom, they'd hope the third person would rat on them. It's hard to get 3 people in agreement. Moreover, those three guards almost always rotated with strangers. Why? If you know someone for a while, you build a relationship. What? You trust them. You might make a plan to run for freedom. So if you're always switching your guards with total strangers, you don't trust them, and therefore you're not going to say, hey, Hans, let's make a run for it tonight when it gets dark, because you're fearful that the other guy will rat you out and get maybe more chocolate or coffee ration or whatever for having ratted you out. So this was called the Berlin Wall. So I'm saying the Iron Curtain, which Churchill had predicted earlier on. So pretty early on, this wall was here. So you couldn't go from here to here. You couldn't go from East Germany to West Germany, or from Czechoslovakia to West Germany. But there's a loophole, was Berlin. So let's say you lived here in, some part of East Germany, Potsdam, or, some other, Chemnitz, or some East German city. You couldn't go this way to freedom because there was a wall. You couldn't fly because really, you couldn't get an airplane to fly to the West. What you could do, though, if you lived in East Germany or Czechoslovakia, you could go to East Berlin. And once you're in East Berlin, you could simply just, walk across a street or catch a train. Maybe you're in East Berlin. So maybe you live in, some part of East Germany. You take a train to East Berlin. In East Berlin, you have your suitcase, whatever. You catch a subway and you go under the city to, 4, 5, 6, 7 stops. And then you come to this place here, you walk up the stairs, ta-da, you're free. Now, you're stuck in you're in West Berlin, okay? But from here, you go to an airport. And if you have the money, now you could fly from West Berlin to West Germany, or for that matter, England or America, or any place if you have the money and the connections to do so. So this is a loophole, and many people were escaping, especially young people who were bright and ambitious. Okay, they were escaping to the West. And so in 1961, that's why then the Germans built this Berlin Wall. It started small. I mean, this whole area is the area around Berlin is I want to say 77 miles, I believe, like from Roanoke to, Farmville, Virginia, almost. Or maybe Appomattox. So it's a very big area. So you couldn't build a wall overnight. So it began small, first with a strand of barbed wire, and then, one row of bricks, another layer. And so the people in the East could see they were being boxed in. And a lot of them in those early days did, try to jump over the wire, or if you're in a house, they might jump over the edge, jump out of a window to escape. So it began small, but as time went on, it got bigger, and also railroads were cut off. You see here railroad tracks, and right there, bam, it just stopped. Someone put these little posts here and barbed wire. And so what had been a railroad was just blocked off. And so you could not go that way anymore. And then what that was, the barbed wire over time became a concrete wall, and eventually, bigger and bigger and bigger wall. And so here I have a map of Berlin. This is East Berlin. And so not only was the wall between East and West Berlin, but in fact, there's a wall in the whole city, because keep in mind, this was also East Germany. This was East Germany. So the wall was not only between East and West Berlin, it was all around West Berlin, because they didn't want people to come from here to escape here or from here to escape in. So it's like the wall was all around the city. And it looked like this. When I was there in 85, 86, so it begun, in the 60s, it was very small. You could conceivably jump over it if you didn't get, shot at by a soldier. But when I was in 85, it was brutal. Almost nobody could escape. When people did escape, the communists would figure out the escape route and then close that off. And so, in fact, it was it was called Berlin Wall. It was really two walls. Here's why. Here's a wall on the western side. Now, this guy, he was walking his dog. This is free. This is the free side. And a lot of graffiti. So on the western side, you could paint things, graffiti, whatever. Some places even had these. It's kind of creepy. They had these metal raised platforms. This was, I think, I want to say 12 feet tall, 12 to 15 feet tall. So if you're standing here, you couldn't see over it. But periodically, the West Germans, just to show the contrast between freedom and democracy, freedom and dictatorship, they built these metal stands and like platforms. You could walk up on the metal steps, and on top there was a flat area you could look over. You're told, you know, it had signs: don't shout, don't throw anything, don't make a scene, it might cause World War III, just be quiet. But you could stand there and look over, and it was incredibly creepy to stand there in freedom and look over. And this is all no man's land. There's some workers there, but this often had mines in it, had floodlights at night. You'd see sometimes soldiers patrolling with German shepherds, machine guns. Here's more barbed wire, and here's a second wall. So over time, let's say there's a building here, someone might try to jump over the wall and escape to freedom. But what had happened was, over time, all these homes were demolished, and it was made just no man's land. So if you try to escape, you'd be seen and shot dead. And here's a second wall with barbed wire. And so over here were the East Germans. It was so creepy. I was told this was true. You could stand here, you could look over at the people. The people there would never look at you. They were looking down, or they were, you know, doing their business over here, going door to door shopping. You never ever saw one look over this way. At least I did not. It was creepy. They're just kind of their own little fish bubbles. A creepy experiment in psychology. So this was what it was like. So here's the side with freedom, no man's land, again, barbed wire, mines, lights, machine guns, guard. Oh, and they had towers. They had guard towers periodically as well. So, but thank goodness it fell on November 4th of 1989. My good friend, he pointed out, we all know the date 9/11. Well, this is 11/9. I'm sorry, November 9th, November 9th. It's just 9/11 switched, the good 9/11, 11/9, November 9th of 1989. I was actually in Taiwan. I'd been there about 2 months, and this was world news. Communism began to fall. First, it fell in Hungary, and then Czechoslovakia, and then by October, November, the East German government was collapsing. And on that day in November, the cry went out, said, hey, the government made an announcement. We're going to lift our border controls, which meant, what it meant was, if you're going to cross the wall, you can do so, and we're not going to shoot you or ask for papers. And so people rushed to the Berlin Wall, climbed up, and then pretty soon began knocking down with sledgehammers. And that was the fall of the Berlin Wall. If you go to the University of Virginia campus in Charlottesville, Virginia, they have a little pavilion there and has a chunk of this Berlin Wall there. Again, it's very creepy. One side had, drawing, all kinds of doodling and art and such. The other side was clean, because obviously this side was clean, because why? You couldn't get anywhere near it. Couldn't get near it. So this side was all drawn up and painted. This side was clear because you couldn't get close to it. Berlin Wall. So that brings you up there. So again, we have kind of just to run down again, NATO was formed in 49. West Germany formed in 49. East Germany formed in 49. Also October 1st of 49 is when Mao Zedong and the communists won the Chinese Civil War, and a fourth of the world became communist. So what a turning point 49 was. In response, the Russians formed what was called the Warsaw Pact. So Russia, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, etc. They formed their own military alliance in opposition to NATO. Of course, they said, "Oh, we're afraid NATO's going to attack us and take away our workers' paradise, so we need to organize." But it was really just their own military alliance. Austria, Yugoslavia, Finland, Switzerland, more neutral countries. So you got NATO in 49, Warsaw Pact 55, West Germany formed, East Germany formed. East Germany's capital was East Berlin. And again, the Berlin Wall began in 61 and fell in 89. And with the fall of communism, the Warsaw Pact has since dissolved. There is no Warsaw Pact. There's still NATO, and ironically, a lot of these former Warsaw Pact countries now belong to NATO. Obviously, Germany unified in 1990. And so that's all NATO country. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, a lot of these countries are now NATO members. These countries here, the Soviet Union split up in end of 1991. In 91, in closing, I'd taken, I was with two buddies, Max and Terry. We're living in Taiwan, three of us foreign guys. And we took the Trans-Siberian Railroad. We flew from Taiwan to Hong Kong, overnight ferry to Guangzhou, China, train to Beijing, and then 6 days and 6 nights, Beijing, overland through Moscow. And then we arrived in Berlin in July of 1991. And it was amazing. The Berlin Wall had fallen 2 years earlier, so it was incredible to be able to cross the city, and the Berlin Wall was gone. There are a few places were left, like as a relic or museum piece, but it was amazing to be there in a unified country. It was called Federal Germany. But because the country had unified in 1990, October, and we arrived in July of 91, the unification was so recent, the city's phone system had not yet been connected, unified. So we arrived on this train from Moscow and Poland. We arrived somewhere to transit in East Germany. I tried to call, I guess like a hotel or someplace. I got to call somebody here on the western side, and I had to dial a different country code. So even though the country was unified, the phone system was not yet connected. And I had to actually use a different country code to call across the city because the phone system was still divided. So that was a little relic from 1991. Thanks for watching. There's been a lot of content. As I love to say to my students, this is not baby food. This has been deep, is a deep dive. Again, I want to thank Giles Milton, amazing writer. If you want to know more about this part of history, I would highly recommend Checkmate in Berlin. And I'm not getting paid to say this. This is not an endorsement, thing where I'm getting paid. I'm just sharing this because I think it's great content. So there you go. Checkmate in Berlin. Thanks for watching. And if you want to improve your English or learn about history, check me out on drowercoaching.com. We have primarily ESL for English learners, but also if you need help with TOEFL, SAT, writing, these things we do as well. Okay. Thanks for watching. God bless you.